On Christmas morning, 1849, the entire Whitmore family of Wilkinson County, Mississippi, 7 people, were found dead in their beds. What made the discovery unforgettable was not just the method of death, but the detail the county coroner refused to include in his official report. Each victim had been positioned with their hands folded and their eyes held open with slivers of wood, forced to stare at the doorway as if witnessing their own killer's departure. The plantation's 89 enslaved people were questioned for weeks. Not one claimed to have heard anything unusual. The investigation concluded with a verdict of mass poisoning by person or persons unknown. The case was quietly closed. But there exists a different story. A story about a man the Whitmores called simply Isaac, who had served the family for 34 years without incident, and what patience becomes capable of when perfected over 3 decades. Before we continue with the story of Isaac and the Christmas that ended the Whitmore line forever, subscribe to this channel right now. And drop your state or city in the comments below. I want to know how far this forgotten piece of American darkness can reach. The Whitmore Empire, wealth built on silent suffering. Wilkinson County, Mississippi, in the autumn of 1815, represented the apex of cotton wealth and social hierarchy in the Deep South, a place where fortunes were measured not in dollars alone, but in the number of human beings a man could claim as property. The Whitmore family had arrived from Virginia 3 years prior, with capital enough to purchase 2,400 acres of prime bottomland along the Mississippi River and 43 enslaved people to work it. Marcus Whitmore, then 32 years old, had inherited a modest tobacco plantation from his father, but recognized that the future of agricultural wealth lay not in Virginia's depleted soil, but in the virgin territories opening across the South, where cotton grew with such abundance that men spoke of it as white gold, as if the crop itself were precious rather than the labor that brought it from seed to market. By 1820, the Whitmores had tripled both their acreage and their human property, expanding through a combination of agricultural innovation and systematic brutality that Marcus preferred to call discipline. He had studied the methods of the most successful planters, had traveled to observe operations in Louisiana and Georgia, and had synthesized from these observations a philosophy of labor management that he believed represented the pinnacle of efficiency. The cotton yield per acre on Whitmore land exceeded that of neighboring plantations by nearly 40%, a statistic that Marcus announced with pride at social gatherings, never mentioning the 16-hour workdays during harvest season, the reduced rations used as punishment for perceived slowness, or the isolation cells built into the barn where uncooperative workers spent days in darkness with minimal food and water. The mansion the Whitmores built in 1823 stood as a monument to this prosperity. 3 stories of imported brick and marble with columns that could be seen from the river road 2 miles distant, announcing to all who passed that the family had achieved the American dream that only some were permitted to pursue. The construction had taken 2 years and required skills that Marcus's enslaved workers did not initially possess, so he hired a master builder from New Orleans and forced his own carpenters to learn by assisting, a process that involved numerous beatings for mistakes, for slowness, for any failure to immediately comprehend techniques they were seeing for the first time. The interior featured hand-carved banisters shipped from Philadelphia, wallpaper imported from France, and chandeliers from a Boston manufacturer who specialized in equipping the homes of the newly wealthy. Every detail proclaimed refinement, civilization, culture. No detail acknowledged the foundation upon which this elevation was built. The Whitmore social circle expanded in direct proportion to their wealth. By 1825, they were hosting quarterly dinners for the county's most prominent families, events where planters discussed cotton futures and politics, while enslaved servants moved silently through rooms serving food they had prepared, but would not themselves eat except as leftovers, if any remained. Elizabeth Whitmore, whom Marcus had married in 1818, managed these events with the precision of a military campaign, understanding that social standing in Mississippi society required not just wealth, but the proper display of it, the correct balance between ostentation and taste, between abundance and elegance. She had studied the manners of Charleston society during a year spent with cousins before her marriage, and she brought these refinements to Wilkinson County as a kind of colonization, teaching other plantation wives how to properly arrange a table, how to direct servants with subtle gestures rather than shouted orders, how to maintain the fiction that gracious living emerged naturally from good breeding, rather than from the systematic exploitation of human beings treated as livestock. Isaac, the child who arrived in chains. Isaac was 15 years old when he was purchased at a New Orleans auction in April of 1815, one of the original 43 people who would form the foundation of Whitmore prosperity, though the word foundation suggests choice, suggests participation in construction, and Isaac had chosen nothing about his presence on that auction block. His previous owner, a merchant named Laurent Devereaux, had died suddenly of yellow fever, and the estate was being liquidated to settle debts that Devereaux's widow lacked the resources to pay. The auction took place in a warehouse near the port, where the smell of the river mixed with the smell of human fear and the smell of the breakfast that the prospective buyers ate while examining their potential purchases, as if selecting horses, checking teeth, demanding that the auction demonstrate strength by lifting heavy sacks, inspecting bodies for scars that might indicate a history of resistance or injury that might affect future productivity. The records from that auction, preserved in the Whitmore family papers and later deposited in a Mississippi historical archive, describe Isaac simply as male, approximately 15 years, good teeth, no visible defects, some education in carpentry, purchased for $620, which was considered a fair price for a young man with useful skills. What the records do not mention, because such information held no commercial value, was that Isaac had been born free in Saint-Domingue, that his parents had been landowners of modest means, farmers who cultivated coffee on a small holding in the island's mountainous interior, far from the great sugar plantations where slavery's worst excesses were practiced. He had spent the first 10 years of his life learning to read, learning his father's trade of carpentry, learning the rhythms of a childhood that included both work and play, both discipline and affection, both expectations and the possibility of exceeding them. The Haitian Revolution had destroyed this life with a completeness that still haunted Isaac's dreams 15 years later, though he had learned never to speak of these dreams, never to acknowledge that he remembered anything before the chains. He had been 10 years old when the violence reached his family's farm in 1804, during the final brutal months when Jean-Jacques Dessalines was consolidating power and eliminating anyone perceived as connected to the French colonial system. Isaac's parents, despite their modest status, despite having supported independence, were killed because they had once sold coffee to French merchants, because in the chaos of revolution, past associations became death sentences, because violence once unleashed develops its own momentum, its own logic that has nothing to do with justice. Isaac had hidden in the root cellar while his parents were murdered, had stayed there for 2 days before hunger drove him out, had been found by men who saw in a traumatized child not someone who needed protection, but someone who could be sold. The journey from Saint-Domingue to New Orleans took 6 weeks aboard a ship that carried both legitimate cargo and human beings, acquired through means the captain did not inquire about too closely. Isaac learned during those weeks that survival required silence, required the burial of everything he had been beneath a surface of compliance so complete it appeared as emptiness. He learned that showing intelligence drew suspicion, that remembering freedom drew punishment, that the past was a luxury he could no longer afford to carry. By the time Marcus Whitmore examined him at the auction, commenting favorably on his build and his hands, Isaac had perfected a blankness that white men interpreted as proof of natural inferiority. never recognizing it as the mask that trauma wears when revealing itself would mean annihilation. He had been born Isaac Laurent Toussaint, son of Jean-Baptiste and Marie Toussaint, but he answered now to only Isaac. And when Marcus Whitmore asked if he understood English, he said, "Yes, sir," in a voice that carried no accent, no history, no indication that he had ever been anything other than what he appeared to be at that moment. Property waiting to be purchased, a tool ready to be used. The Whitmore method, control through calculated terror. Marcus Whitmore did not believe in the whip alone as a tool of control, though he kept several hanging in visible locations throughout the plantation and used them with regularity when his temper flared or when he judged that a public demonstration of authority was required to maintain order. He believed instead in something more sophisticated, a system he had developed through years of observation and experimentation, a methodology that combined physical punishment with psychological manipulation in proportions he adjusted based on individual responses. He called this approach rational labor management and discussed it with other planters as if it were a scientific breakthrough, as if the systematic destruction of human dignity could be elevated to the status of innovation through careful documentation and consistent application. The core principle of Marcus's method was unpredictability. An enslaved worker who exceeded productivity quotas might be rewarded with an extra ration of salt pork or tobacco, might be granted permission to visit a spouse living on a neighboring plantation, might even receive a few coins that could be saved toward the theoretical possibility of purchasing freedom that Marcus knew he would never actually permit. That same worker, perhaps the following week, might be singled out for punishment for reasons never adequately explained, for working too quickly and thus making others look slow by comparison, for showing pride in accomplishment, for any behavior that Marcus interpreted as forgetting one's place. The punishment might be a day in the isolation cell with bread and water, might be 10 lashes administered publicly, might be the threat of sale away from family. A threat Marcus wielded like a blade, cutting at attachments without needing to actually separate people, though he did that too when it suited his purposes or when a particularly good offer arrived from a slave trader passing through the county. This calculated inconsistency prevented the formation of plans, the nurturing of hope, the possibility of organized resistance. Because how could one plan when the rules changed without pattern? How could one hope when improvement of condition might come or might be destroyed, based on the incomprehensible whims of a master who seemed to delight in proving that he alone controlled the levers of pleasure and pain? Marcus understood that human beings could endure extraordinary physical hardship if they believed it served a purpose, if they could predict cause and effect, if they maintained some sense of agency over their circumstances. His genius, if such a word can be applied to such darkness, was in systematically destroying this sense of agency, in creating a world where effort and outcome bore no reliable relationship, where the only certainty was that Marcus Whitmore held absolute power over every aspect of existence, from the work you performed, to the food you ate, to whether your children would sleep beside you, or be sold away before they learned to speak your name. The physical layout of the plantation reinforced this control. The quarters where enslaved workers lived were positioned within sight of the main house, arranged in 2 rows that formed a corridor Marcus could observe from his study window. He conducted random inspections at varying hours, sometimes arriving at dawn, sometimes at midnight, never establishing a pattern, always finding something to criticize. A cabin not swept to his satisfaction, a cooking fire built incorrectly, a child making too much noise. The plantation bell that marked the beginning and end of workdays rang according to Marcus's mood rather than any fixed schedule. Sometimes the workday began before dawn, sometimes after, and enslaved workers learned to wake early and wait in anxious uncertainty, because being late to the fields meant punishment. But arriving too early was interpreted as laziness, as trying to avoid work by standing idle. Elizabeth Whitmore, the mistress who called Cruelty. Love. Elizabeth Whitmore era. Née Carlyle had been raised in Charleston society, educated in music and French, in watercolor painting, and the delicate art of managing a household built on foundations she had been taught never to examine too closely. Her father owned a successful import business and 12 enslaved people who maintained the family's townhouse and served at the dinners where Charleston's mercantile elite discussed cotton prices and tariff policies, with the same detachment they might apply to discussing weather. Elizabeth's education had included instruction from her mother in how to direct servants, lessons delivered in the parlor while enslaved women stood nearby demonstrating proper postures for serving tea, proper methods for arranging flowers, proper responses when given corrections. "Be firm but not harsh," her mother had advised. "They are like children who will take advantage of any weakness, any inconsistency. You must love them enough to correct them, to guide them toward civilization, even though they can never fully achieve it." This was the philosophy Elizabeth brought to Wilkinson County when she married Marcus Whitmore in 1818. A philosophy that allowed her to commit extraordinary cruelty while believing herself to be performing acts of Christian charity. She took particular interest in the enslaved women who worked in her house, imposing standards of cleanliness and behavior that were designed to be impossible to maintain perfectly, creating a system where failure was inevitable and thus punishment was constant. The mansion's floors were to be scrubbed daily on hands and knees with brushes that wore the skin from fingers. The silver was to be polished until Elizabeth could see her reflection without distortion. The beds were to be made with corners tight enough to bounce a coin, a trick she had learned from reading about military discipline and had adapted to domestic management. The women who failed these inspections, and someone always failed, because Elizabeth ensured it through standards that shifted without warning, received corrections that Elizabeth designed to leave no visible marks, nothing that would prompt questions from visitors or interfere with the women's ability to continue working. Her favorite punishment involved forcing a woman to stand in the root cellar for hours, sometimes overnight, hands bound to a beam above her head so that she could neither sit nor fully stand, muscles screaming in positions that left lasting damage to shoulders and backs. Elizabeth called this reflection time, explaining to the victims that they needed silence and solitude to contemplate their failures, to pray for the strength to improve. She sometimes visited during these sessions, bringing a lamp and a Bible, reading aloud from passages about obedience and servitude while the woman hung in darkness and pain, unable to respond, unable to move, forced to perform gratitude for this spiritual instruction. When Elizabeth finally released them, she required that they thank her, that they acknowledge her patience and kindness, and if the thanks did not sound sufficiently sincere, the punishment would be extended another day. What made Elizabeth particularly dangerous was her absolute conviction that her actions were motivated by love, by a sincere desire to elevate those beneath her toward a civilization they could approach, but never enter. She kept a journal where she recorded her efforts at improvement, noting which women responded well to correction, which required more intensive guidance, which showed signs of progress in cleanliness, in obedience, in the proper demeanor of grateful submission. She never used words like torture or cruelty in these pages. She wrote instead about discipline and education, about the burden of responsibility that came with ownership, about her hopes that through patient instruction she might help these childlike creatures develop at least some capacity for moral behavior. The Whitmore children, learning cruelty as a native language. The 3 Whitmore daughters and 2 sons were raised in an environment where enslaved people existed as furniture that occasionally required maintenance, as tools that sometimes broke and needed replacement, as a permanent servant class whose presence was so normalized that the children literally could not imagine a world organized differently. They were not taught to hate, Hatred would have required acknowledgement of shared humanity, some recognition that the people serving their meals and washing their clothes possessed inner lives worth opposing. Instead, they were taught something more insidious and more durable, that human beings came in fundamentally different categories, that some people were born to command and others born to obey, that this arrangement was natural, ordained by God, as unchangeable as the weather or the turning of seasons. Young Marcus Jr., 8 years old in 1849, had already developed his father's habits of casual violence, striking out at enslaved children who played too loudly near the house, demanding immediate obedience to commands he issued in imitation of his father's authoritative tone. He had been given as a personal servant a boy named Peter, 2 years his senior, whose job was to dress young Marcus, to fetch his toys, to take punishment when young Marcus made mistakes that might otherwise reflect poorly on the family. When young Marcus failed his Latin lessons, it was Peter who received the switching, a practice Marcus Sr. had implemented to teach his son about the consequences of failure and the burden of command. Young Marcus had learned from this that power meant never having to accept blame, that there would always be someone beneath you to absorb the impact of your errors, your tempers, your casual cruelties disguised as lessons. Helena Whitmore, 17 years old and preparing for her debut into Mississippi society, had inherited her mother's gift for psychological torture, dressed as improvement. She supervised the enslaved girls who served as her maids, critiquing their speech patterns, their postures, their facial expressions, with a cruelty that was all the more cutting, because it was delivered in soft tones, with explanations that framed cruelty as guidance. When a girl named Ruth failed to lace Helena's corset to the exact tightness demanded, Helena did not strike her, but instead spent an hour detailing Ruth's inadequacies, her stupidity, her fundamental inability to learn even simple tasks, speaking with the measured disappointment of a teacher forced to acknowledge a student's hopeless limitations. These sessions left Ruth in tears, which prompted further criticism about emotional displays being inappropriate for a servant, about the need for self-control that Ruth clearly lacked. Helena believed she was preparing these girls for lives of better service, never recognizing that she was simply practicing the sadism she would later perfect as a plantation mistress herself. The younger children, Catherine, 13, William, 11, and Margaret, 9, had been shaped by this environment from birth, having never known a world where they dressed themselves, prepared their own food, or cleaned their own messes. They had enslaved women who had nursed them as infants, who had taught them to walk, who had comforted them through childhood illnesses and nightmares, and yet they felt no gratitude toward these women, because gratitude requires recognizing the humanity of the person serving you, requires acknowledging that their labor is a gift rather than an obligation. The children called these women by first names while being addressed as Miss Catherine or Master William, a linguistic hierarchy that reinforced the unbridgeable distance between them. They had been taught that affection toward enslaved people was acceptable in childhood, but must be outgrown. That attachment was a childish weakness that maturity would cure. That one day they would understand that servants were not companions, but property requiring firm management. Isaac's rise. Becoming indispensable through invisible excellence. Over 3 decades, Isaac transformed himself from field hand to master carpenter, to house servant, to something that had no precise title, but encompassed elements of all 3. A position he had engineered with the patience of someone who understood that survival required becoming simultaneously indispensable and invisible. The transformation began slowly, with demonstrations of skill that Marcus Whitmore could not ignore even if he wanted to maintain Isaac in field labor. When the plantation's storage barn required repairs in 1818, Isaac volunteered his carpentry knowledge, completing the work with such precision that Marcus reassigned him permanently to construction and maintenance projects. This was the first step in a decades-long campaign to position himself closer to the Whitmore family, to make himself useful in ways that granted access to their private spaces, their unguarded conversations, their vulnerabilities. By 1825, Isaac had been brought into the main house to oversee renovations that Marcus had planned to expand the kitchen and add a second-floor library. He worked alongside hired craftsmen from Natchez, learning their techniques while teaching them the efficient methods he had developed. Marcus noticed that projects Isaac supervised finished ahead of schedule and under budget, that enslaved workers performed better under Isaac's quiet direction than under the shouting overseers Marcus typically employed. There was something about Isaac's presence that inspired competence, a quality Marcus attributed to natural leadership, rather than recognizing it as the result of respect that flowed between people who saw each other as human beings rather than property and owner. Isaac learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to solve problems before they were noticed, to make himself so essential to the plantation's daily operations that the Whitmores began to forget he existed, except as a solution to their various inconveniences. When Elizabeth complained about the household staff's inefficiency, Marcus suggested that Isaac coordinate their activities. When young Marcus Jr. needed someone to teach him basic carpentry as preparation for eventually managing the plantation, Isaac became his instructor. When guests visited and required entertainment, Isaac played violin with skill that surprised the Whitmores, who had never thought to ask if he possessed such talents. Though he had been practicing in the quarters for years, had been taught by his father in Saint-Domingue during a childhood the Whitmores knew nothing about. This invisibility was Isaac's weapon and his shield, a deliberate construction that required enormous discipline to maintain. While the Whitmores saw only a loyal servant who had been properly broken to his station, who had accepted his place with the gratitude they believed they deserved, Isaac was studying everything. He studied their routines, learning that Marcus walked the plantation boundaries every Tuesday morning, that Elizabeth visited the quarters for inspections every Saturday afternoon, that the family attended church in town every Sunday, leaving the house minimally supervised for 3 hours. He studied their vulnerabilities, Marcus's temper that made him careless when angry, Elizabeth's vanity that made her susceptible to flattery, the children's thoughtless cruelty that revealed how completely they discounted enslaved people as sources of danger. Every confidence the Whitmores spoke in his presence, every moment they forgot to guard their words because they no longer saw him as a person who might listen, became information he stored with meticulous care. He learned which neighboring planters were in debt, which marriages were failing, which families had secrets they desperately wanted to protect. He learned the gossip that white people shared freely in front of servants, operating under the delusion that enslaved people either could not understand their conversations or could not possibly care about white people's problems enough to remember the details. The breaking. What Marcus Whitmore did in December 1848. December of 1848 brought the event that would transform Isaac's patient observation into active planning, though no one at the time recognized the shift, least of all Marcus Whitmore, who considered the transaction nothing more than sound business. Isaac had been permitted through years of demonstrated loyalty to maintain a family in the quarters, a privilege extended to valued enslaved workers as a method of encouraging stability and reducing the likelihood of escape attempts. His wife Sarah had been purchased in 1820 specifically because Marcus believed that married workers were more reliable, less inclined toward rebellion, more invested in maintaining the status quo that allowed them the small mercy of sleeping beside someone they loved. Isaac and Sarah had 2 children, a boy named Benjamin, 6 years old, and a girl named Grace, 4 years old. The children had been born on the plantation and were by all measures of Mississippi law Marcus Whitmore's property to dispose of as he saw fit, a legal reality that Isaac had lived with in silent horror since the moment each child was born, knowing that parenthood under slavery meant loving someone you had no power to protect. He had watched his children grow, had taught Benjamin the alphabet in secret, had carved small wooden toys for Grace, had held them during illnesses and told them stories from his own childhood that he had sworn never to speak aloud, had given them everything he possessed while knowing it might all be taken away on the whim of a man who valued them only as future labor or present capital. When Harold Pemberton, a planter from Adams County, visited the Whitmore plantation in mid-December to discuss a potential cotton sale, he mentioned in passing that he was looking to purchase young children to train as house servants. His own enslaved population was aging, and he wanted to begin preparing the next generation while they were still young enough to be molded properly. Marcus saw opportunity in this request, saw a chance to command premium prices for children who were currently providing no labor value, who were consuming resources while contributing nothing to productivity. He offered Benjamin and Grace without consulting Isaac, without considering that a father might have opinions about the sale of his children, because such consideration would have required acknowledging that enslaved people experienced emotions beyond the basic drives that white people attributed to livestock. The transaction was concluded quickly. Pemberton paid $900 for both children, a price Marcus considered excellent for such young stock. The sale was scheduled for December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, timing that Marcus selected because Pemberton wanted the children delivered before the holiday, so they could begin their training immediately in the new year. Isaac learned about the sale on December 22nd, when Marcus informed him casually while Isaac was repairing a fence near the main house. Marcus delivered the news as if announcing a change in dinner plans, explaining that the money would be invested in new equipment that would improve conditions for everyone on the plantation, as if this economic justification might somehow transform amputation into acceptable surgery. Isaac's response was everything Marcus expected from a properly broken slave. He said nothing. His face showed nothing. He nodded once to indicate he had heard, and then he returned to his work on the fence. Marcus noted with satisfaction that Isaac had finally learned complete acceptance of his station, that decades of firm discipline had produced exactly the kind of worker Marcus believed represented the ideal: competent, obedient, emotionally manageable. What Marcus could not see, what his certainty of power rendered him incapable of recognizing, was that Isaac's silence was not acceptance, but calculation, that the careful mask Isaac had maintained for 33 years had just become something else entirely, had transformed from a shield protecting a man still hoping for mercy into a weapon being sharpened for use. The year of perfect compliance, Isaac's final performance. The year that followed the sale of his children saw Isaac transform into a model of servitude so perfect that even Elizabeth Whitmore, who trusted no enslaved person completely, remarked upon it in her journal. He worked longer hours without being asked, accepted every task without the slightest hesitation, and performed duties with an attention to detail that exceeded anything he had shown in previous decades. When Marcus needed someone to coordinate the spring planting, Isaac volunteered detailed plans that increased efficiency. When Elizabeth required reorganization of the household staff, Isaac implemented a new system that reduced conflicts and improved service. He smiled more often, a development that Elizabeth interpreted as evidence that he had finally achieved the contentment that came from accepting God's plan for the natural hierarchy of races. Those who had known Isaac longest in the quarters noticed something different, though they struggled to articulate what had changed. His face still showed the expressions of compliance and cooperation that had characterized his demeanor for years. But there was something behind his eyes that one woman would later describe as watching a man who had already died, but whose body had not realized it yet. He spoke less during the evening gatherings in the quarters, spent more time alone in his cabin, and stopped mentioning Sarah or the children, even when others asked if he had received news about them. He had become less present somehow, as if the essential part of him that animated his daily actions had departed, leaving behind only the mechanical performance of tasks by a body that continued functioning through habit rather than will. Marcus Whitmore noticed none of these subtle changes because they manifested as exactly what he wanted to see. Confirmation that his system worked, that firm discipline eventually produced the desired results, that Isaac's earlier attachment to his children had been the last remnant of inappropriate sentiment that needed to be corrected. He began holding Isaac up as an example to other planters, explaining during dinners and social gatherings how patience and consistency in managing enslaved workers eventually yielded loyalty that was more reliable than affection, more durable than fear. Isaac would sometimes be summoned to these gatherings to demonstrate his competence, to answer questions about plantation operations, to show visiting planters what a well-trained servant looked like. And he performed these demonstrations flawlessly, speaking when spoken to, showing deference without servility, displaying exactly the demeanor that white men interpreted as evidence of their own superiority. What the Whitmores could not perceive was that Isaac's perfect performance was preparation, that every act of compliance was practice for the greatest performance he would ever give. He was learning their patterns with renewed intensity, noting when each family member retired for the night, which foods they preferred, which dishes were prepared specially for them versus served to everyone at the table. He was testing the limits of his access, finding excuses to enter the kitchen at various hours, to observe the preparation of meals, to understand the household's rhythms with the thoroughness of someone planning an operation, where a single mistake would mean failure and death. In the quarters at night, Isaac began asking careful questions about plants, about illnesses, about the symptoms various people had experienced during sickness. He framed these questions as concern for the community's health, as interest in folk remedies that might help if someone fell ill. He learned which herbs grew in the woods surrounding the plantation, which mushrooms appeared in autumn, which plants the elderly women warned children never to touch. He gathered this information piece by piece, never asking too much of any one person, never revealing the pattern his questions formed. The Underground Network. Information, as currency. Mississippi's enslaved population maintained a communication system that the white families who owned them never fully comprehended, a network built on relationships between plantations, sustained by hired-out workers who traveled, by enslaved people who accompanied their owners on social visits, by those who sold produce at town markets, by the deliberate creation of connections that transcended the boundaries white people drew between properties. Information traveled through this network with remarkable speed and accuracy. News of sales, of punishment, of opportunities, of dangers, of escape routes, and of white people's vulnerabilities. Isaac had been part of this network since 1815, but after December 1848, he began using it with focused intention, gathering specific knowledge he needed for a plan that was still forming in his mind. He learned from a man who worked on the Pemberton plantation that Benjamin and Grace had arrived safely, that they were being trained as house servants, but were too young yet to understand the permanence of their separation from their parents. This information brought Isaac both relief and renewed determination. He learned from a woman whose husband worked at a neighboring estate about which doctors in the county were competent, and which merely provided diagnoses that wealthy patients wanted to hear. He learned from an elderly woman in the quarters who had been born in Carolina about plants her grandmother had used for healing and for harm, about the deathcap mushrooms that grew near rotting logs, about foxglove that grew wild in certain meadows, about oleander bushes that produced beautiful flowers and deadly poison. He learned about dosages through careful questioning disguised as academic curiosity. How much of a thing would make someone sick versus how much would kill them? What symptoms did various poisons produce? How quickly did they act? Could they be detected in food or drink? The answers came from multiple sources, none of whom understood why Isaac wanted this information, most of whom assumed he was asking out of the general interest enslaved people, often developed in knowledge that white people tried to restrict. Some who shared information with him suspected his intentions, but said nothing, operating under an unspoken code that what enslaved people did to protect themselves or to resist their oppression was not subject to judgment or interference from others who shared their condition. Through this network, Isaac also learned techniques of preparation, how certain plants needed to be dried, how others needed to be fresh, how heat could concentrate or neutralize toxins, how combinations of substances might produce effects that individual poisons could not achieve. He learned that some poisons acted immediately while others could be designed to delay their effects, allowing the poisoner to be far from the scene when death occurred. He learned which symptoms doctors would recognize as suspicious and which they would attribute to natural causes, to bad food, to sudden illness that sometimes struck without warning. This education took months, required conversations with dozens of people, and demanded that Isaac reveal nothing of his purpose, even as he gathered comprehensive knowledge about how to kill efficiently and undetectably. He practiced patience in his learning, as he had practiced patience in his servitude, understanding that rushing would invite questions, would create suspicion, would potentially alert the very people he was planning to target. By the autumn of 1849, he possessed theoretical knowledge sufficient to his purpose. What remained was the practical application, the timing, the creation of opportunity. Christmas, 1849, preparations as prayer. The weeks leading up to Christmas 1849 saw the Whitmore plantation engaged in elaborate preparations that the season demanded from families of their social standing. Elizabeth had been planning since October, had sent letters to neighboring estates inviting the county's most prominent families to Christmas Eve dinner, an event she intended as both celebration and demonstration of Whitmore prosperity. The guest list included 47 people, representing every planter family within 20 miles whose social status warranted inclusion. The menu required weeks of preparation: ducks and geese from the plantation's own poultry yards, a pig that had been specially fattened since summer, oysters ordered from the coast and transported in barrels of ice, vegetables that had been preserved from autumn harvest, elaborate desserts that required imported ingredients and skills that enslaved cooks had been forced to develop through trial and punishment for error. Isaac, as senior house servant and coordinator of household operations, was placed in charge of ensuring that every element came together flawlessly. He supervised the cleaning of the mansion's public rooms, the polishing of silver that had not been used since the previous Christmas, the arrangement of greenery brought from the woods to decorate mantels and doorways. He worked with the cooks to plan timing so that each course would be prepared at the correct temperature, would be served at the proper moment, would reflect the excellence that Elizabeth demanded. He was in every room, touching every element, managing every detail, and no one thought to question his presence or his access, because he had spent 34 years making himself indispensable, making his involvement in household operations appear natural and necessary. In the kitchen, where enslaved women prepared food for the Christmas feast under conditions of extreme pressure and scrutiny, Isaac moved with quiet authority, solving problems, preventing conflicts, ensuring that work progressed smoothly. He tasted dishes as they were prepared, ostensibly to confirm seasoning and quality, actually learning the flavors so he would know how much alteration he could make without detection. He observed which dishes were intended for the family specifically, versus which would be served to all guests, noting that the Whitmores had certain preferences. Marcus liked his duck prepared with particular spices. Elizabeth preferred sweeter desserts. The children had portions adjusted to their ages and appetites. On December 23rd, Isaac made a journey to the woods, telling the overseer he needed to gather additional greenery for decorations. He returned with magnolia branches and holly, and hidden among these seasonal decorations were mushrooms he had found growing near a rotting oak log, mushrooms that the elderly woman in the quarters had described in careful detail, warning him never to touch them without wrapping his hands first, because even skin contact with the deadliest varieties could cause illness. He had wrapped his hands in cloth and had gathered only what he needed, leaving no evidence of his harvest beyond a few missing mushrooms that would never be noticed in the vast woods surrounding the plantation. The preparation of poison became an act of concentration that felt almost like prayer, though Isaac had long since abandoned any belief in a God who would permit the world he had experienced. He worked late at night in his cabin, using techniques he had learned through months of careful inquiry, drying and grinding and mixing with precision that his carpentry training had taught him to value. The result was a powder that had no distinctive smell, that would dissolve in liquid or could be mixed into food, that in the dosages he had calculated would not act immediately, but would allow its victims to finish their meal, to complete their evening, to retire to their beds believing themselves safe and satisfied, before the poison began its work of shutting down respiratory systems so gently that death would come as if sleep had simply deepened beyond the point of return. The dinner, a feast, prepared by patient hands. Christmas Eve. Dinner at the Whitmore plantation began at 7 o'clock, with 47 guests arriving in carriages that lined the circular drive, their drivers directed to the stables where enslaved workers took charge of horses and vehicles, while the wealthy entered a mansion transformed by candlelight and greenery into something that seemed to glow with prosperity. The women wore gowns imported from New York and Paris, jewels that caught the light from chandeliers, elaborate hairstyles that had required hours of work by enslaved women who would never wear such finery themselves. The men discussed cotton prices and politics, the growing tensions between North and South, the interference of abolitionists who understood nothing about the economic realities of plantation agriculture, or the natural hierarchy of races that made slavery not just profitable, but morally necessary. Or so they convinced themselves over whiskey, that had been aging since before some of them were born. Elizabeth Whitmore moved through her guests with practiced grace, accepting compliments on the decorations, on the magnificence of her home, on the excellence of her household management. She had achieved exactly what she intended, a demonstration that the Whitmores stood among the county's finest families, that their wealth was matched by their refinement, that they embodied the best of what Mississippi society could produce. Marcus stood near the fireplace in the main parlor, holding court among the men, discussing the political situation with the authority of someone whose economic success was taken as evidence of wisdom about all subjects. The children, scrubbed and dressed in their finest clothes, were displayed briefly to guests who remarked on how well-mannered they appeared, how promising young Marcus seemed, how beautiful the daughters were becoming. The meal itself was a triumph of forced labor disguised as hospitality. 7 courses served over 3 hours, each dish prepared with ingredients that represented the plantation's abundance. The duck and venison from their own lands, vegetables from their gardens, oysters purchased with money extracted from cotton grown by people who would taste none of this feast. The guests ate with enthusiasm, praising each course, remarking on the skill of the cooks without ever wondering about the conditions under which such skill had been developed, the punishments that had taught precision through fear of failure. Isaac moved through the evening with invisible efficiency, directing the enslaved workers who served the meal, ensuring that wine glasses remained filled, that empty plates were cleared promptly, that the elaborate choreography of formal dining proceeded without disruption. He had trained the serving staff carefully, had drilled them on the precise order of service, the proper way to present each dish, the demeanor expected when moving through rooms full of white people whose comfort depended on not noticing the individual serving them. And in the kitchen, during the brief moments between courses when he checked on preparations for the next dish, he made small adjustments that no one observed. Additions to certain plates, the ones that had been marked specifically for the Whitmore family, modifications so subtle that the food's appearance and taste remained unchanged. The Whitmores ate their specially prepared portions without suspicion, without hesitation, secure in their world and their place in it. Marcus consumed his duck with evident pleasure, complimenting the seasoning. Elizabeth sampled her dessert and announced it perfect. The children ate the portions Isaac had personally ensured reached their places at the table. And when the guests finally departed near midnight, when the enslaved workers were dismissed to their quarters for their own abbreviated Christmas celebration, when the Whitmore family retired to their respective bedrooms full of food and satisfaction, Isaac remained in the kitchen, washing dishes, cleaning surfaces, wading through the dark hours with patience that had been refined over 34 years into something approaching art. The silent night, while Christmas carols played. After the guests departed and the mansion settled into the quiet that comes when performance ends and people retreat into private spaces, the Whitmore family prepared for bed with the rituals that mark their nightly routines. Marcus checked the locks on the doors, a habit he maintained despite never seriously believing his enslaved workers posed any danger. They had been properly trained, properly broken, and besides, where would they go? Elizabeth spent time at her dressing table while her personal maid removed the elaborate hairstyle and helped her into a nightgown, then dismissed the woman with instructions to return at 7 in the morning. The children were attended by their nurses, who tucked them into beds in rooms that reflected their status, furnished with imported furniture, heated by fireplaces that enslaved workers had prepared, decorated with toys and books that represented privileges they accepted as natural rights, rather than recognizing them as luxuries built on others' suffering. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the mansion was dark and silent, its occupants sleeping deeply, their digestion processing the feast they had consumed, their bodies beginning to absorb the poison that Isaac had administered with dosages calculated to allow exactly this: a peaceful retirement to bed, a drifting into sleep that would deepen beyond the point of return as the toxins began their work. Isaac had designed the timing carefully, had studied enough to understand that he needed them unconscious before the symptoms became severe enough to cause alarm, needed them isolated in their separate bedrooms where they would die without disturbing each other, without raising any alarm that might bring help before the poison completed its work. He waited in the kitchen until he was certain that enough time had passed, that the household had settled completely into sleep. Then he moved through the mansion with a lamp turned low, checking each bedroom in turn, confirming what he already knew would be true. Marcus and Elizabeth in their bed, still breathing but shallowly, beyond the point where anything could save them. The children in their rooms, their smaller bodies more quickly affected by the poison, already past the point of response. Isaac felt no triumph in these observations, no satisfaction, only a cold certainty that what needed to be done was proceeding exactly as planned. What he did next was not part of necessity, but of message, a statement he intended to leave for whoever discovered the bodies, though he knew the meaning would likely never be understood or would be deliberately suppressed. He arranged each body carefully, folding their hands across their chests, as if preparing them for burial, a gesture that mimicked the care that white people showed their own dead but rarely extended to those they enslaved. And then he did something that would become the detail that haunted everyone who entered those rooms. He placed small wooden splinters to hold their eyes open, forcing their dead faces to stare at the doorways, to maintain a gaze fixed on the exit they would never use, on the freedom from their presence that he was creating. This work took hours, moving from room to room, staging 7 scenes of death that would appear peaceful, except for the eyes. Always the eyes. When he finished, dawn was approaching. He returned to the kitchen and cleaned every surface he had touched, removed every trace of the preparations he had made, destroyed the remaining poison by burning it in the kitchen fire until nothing remained but ash that looked like any other ash. Then he went to his cabin in the quarters and lay down on the bed where he had once slept beside Sarah, where his children had sometimes crawled in during thunderstorms seeking comfort, and he waited for the alarm that would come with Christmas morning. Christmas morning, the discovery that broke the county's silence. When Martha, the cook who was scheduled to begin preparing breakfast at 6 o'clock, entered the kitchen on Christmas morning, she noticed immediately that something felt wrong, though she could not articulate what had triggered her unease. The kitchen was clean, cleaner than it usually was after a major dinner, with every pot and pan put away, every surface wiped, every dish stacked in precise order. It was too perfect, she would later say, as if someone had tried to erase all evidence that the previous evening had occurred. She went about her work mechanically, preparing the coffee that the family expected first thing each morning, setting out cups, and preparing the breakfast that would need to be ready when the Whitmores rose. By 8 o'clock, no one from the family had appeared, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Sometimes after late entertaining, the household slept later than normal. By 9 o'clock, Martha's unease had grown into worry. She climbed the stairs and knocked softly on Marcus Whitmore's bedroom door, waited for a response, knocked again more loudly when none came. When the continued silence became unbearable, she opened the door and saw what would live in her nightmares for the remainder of her life. Marcus and Elizabeth Whitmore in their bed, positioned as if sleeping peacefully, except they were not sleeping. Their skin had the wrong color, their stillness had the wrong quality, and their eyes were open, held open by small pieces of wood, staring at the doorway where Martha stood frozen in horror. Her screams brought other household servants running, brought Isaac from where he had been waiting in the quarters, brought the overseer from his cabin. They found the same scene in every bedroom: 7 bodies arranged with identical precision, 7 pairs of eyes forced to maintain their final gaze, 7 deaths that had occurred silently in the night while the rest of the plantation slept. The overseer sent a rider immediately to fetch Sheriff Braddock and Dr. Merrick, then tried to establish some kind of order among the enslaved workers who had gathered, some of whom were crying, some of whom stood in shocked silence, some of whom showed expressions the overseer could not quite read, expressions that might have been grief or might have been something else entirely. Sheriff Braddock arrived within 2 hours, bringing with him Dr. Merrick and 3 deputies who fanned out across the property to interview everyone who lived or worked at the plantation. The scene they encountered in the mansion defied immediate explanation. No signs of forced entry, no indication of struggle, no weapons found. The house had not been robbed. Marcus's cash box remained untouched in his study. Elizabeth's jewelry lay undisturbed on her dressing table. The silver that had been used for last night's dinner was still in the dining room, cleaned and ready to be stored. Whatever had happened here had not been motivated by theft. Dr. Merrick examined each body carefully, noting the symptoms he observed: the slight foam at the corners of mouths, the discoloration of fingernails, the specific rigidity of muscles. Details that suggested poison, but of a type he could not immediately identify. The wooden splinters holding eyes open disturbed him more than the deaths themselves, because they indicated someone had entered each room after death had occurred, had spent time arranging the bodies, had wanted to leave a message that Merrick understood would create panic among every white family in the county if it became widely known. Someone had killed the entire Whitmore family in their beds without raising alarm, without leaving obvious evidence, and had done so with a deliberateness that suggested this was not impulsive rage but carefully planned execution. The investigation. Questions without answers. The investigation that Sheriff Thomas Braddock conducted over the following 3 weeks represented one of the most extensive inquiries ever undertaken in Wilkinson County. But it was doomed from the start by assumptions that prevented investigators from pursuing the most obvious explanation. Braddock operated under the certainty that if an enslaved person had committed this crime, Other enslaved people would know about it, would eventually reveal it under sufficient pressure, because he could not imagine that someone could plan and execute such an action entirely alone, without assistance, without anyone noticing preparations or suspicious behavior. He interviewed every person who lived on the Whitmore plantation, using methods that ranged from careful questioning to outright torture. But he learned nothing useful because there was nothing to learn. Isaac had planned alone, had prepared alone, had acted alone, and had left no evidence that pointed toward him more than toward anyone else. The investigation examined the Christmas Eve dinner with particular attention, questioning every cook who had prepared food, every servant who had served it, everyone who had access to the kitchen during the evening. But the dinner had been eaten by 47 guests, none of whom had suffered any ill effects, which seemed to eliminate the meal as the source of poison. What the investigators did not realize was that only the Whitmore family's specific portions had been poisoned, that Isaac had been careful to ensure that only the people he intended to kill consumed the substances he had prepared. The guests had eaten safely from the same dishes, a fact that made the poisoning appear impossible, unless one assumed a level of planning and precision that Braddock could not believe any enslaved person capable of achieving. Dr. Merrick's examination revealed what he suspected, but could not definitively prove: a combination of plant-based toxins that would be nearly impossible to detect with the medical technology available in 1849. The symptoms were consistent with several different poisons, which suggested either a sophisticated knowledge of toxic substances or remarkably fortunate improvisation. He found traces of what might have been deathcap mushrooms, possibly foxglove, perhaps other substances he could not identify. The dosages had been calculated to kill without causing violent symptoms that might wake the victims or alert others in the house. This level of sophistication troubled Merrick deeply, because it indicated not an impulsive act of violence, but something that looked like premeditated murder executed with scientific precision. The wooden splinters holding eyes open became a focus of speculation that led nowhere. Some investigators believed they carried symbolic meaning. Perhaps the killer wanted the victims to see their murderer, wanted them to watch death approach, wanted to deny them even the mercy of closed eyes in death. Others thought the splinters were simply a way to create horror, to maximize the psychological impact of the discovery. No one suggested the interpretation that Isaac had intended, that the Whitmores should be forced to stare at doorways they would never exit, should maintain an eternal gaze on the freedom their deaths created, should perform one final act of witnessing, seeing what they had refused to see in life, the humanity of the person they had treated as property. After 3 weeks of investigation that produced more questions than answers, Sheriff Braddock and Dr. Merrick met privately to discuss their findings and their options. They had no evidence pointing to any specific person. They had theories, but no proof. They had a community of white families becoming increasingly frightened, increasingly convinced that their own enslaved workers might pose dangers they had never seriously considered. And they had a political situation where officially declaring this a murder by poisoning would require an investigation that might never reach resolution, might create social disruption that would damage the county's stability and economy. The decision they made in that private meeting would determine the official narrative of the Whitmore deaths and would allow a murderer to escape justice, though neither man was certain that justice was the correct word for what had occurred. Isaac's performance. The perfect witness. When Isaac was questioned by Sheriff Braddock on the afternoon of December 25th, he presented as the devastated servant, a performance he had been preparing for years, a role he could inhabit so completely that even he sometimes forgot where the mask ended and the man began. He sat in the chair that Braddock indicated, his hands folded in his lap, his posture conveying respect without servility, his expression showing grief that appeared genuine because it was genuine. Grief for what the Whitmores had done to him, grief for his children sold away, Grief for 34 years of endurance that had led to this moment, but grief nonetheless. And Sheriff Braddock interpreted it as grief for the loss of the family Isaac had served. Braddock's questions followed predictable patterns, and Isaac had prepared answers that provided information without revealing anything useful. He described the Christmas Eve dinner in detail, naming the guests who had attended, describing the courses that had been served, explaining his role in coordinating the household staff. He spoke about the Whitmore family's behavior during the evening, noting that they had seemed in excellent health and spirits, that Marcus had been particularly pleased with how well the dinner had impressed their guests, that Elizabeth had been satisfied with every element of the meal's presentation. He mentioned that he had seen each family member retire to their rooms between midnight and 1 o'clock, that nothing had seemed unusual or concerning, that he had finished cleaning the kitchen and had retired to his own cabin around 2 in the morning. When Braddock asked specifically about the food, Isaac provided detailed descriptions of each dish, explaining which cooks had prepared which items, which ingredients had been used, how the meals had been stored before serving. He volunteered that he himself had tasted several dishes during preparation to ensure proper seasoning, a common practice that established his access to the food, but also suggested that if the food had been poisoned, he would have been affected as well. He mentioned that some guests had complained of mild indigestion before leaving, a complete fabrication designed to send the investigation searching for contaminated ingredients that had affected only those with sensitive digestion, though this line of inquiry would eventually reveal that no guests had actually reported any illness. Throughout the interrogation, Isaac maintained perfect consistency in his responses, never contradicting himself, never showing nervousness or evasiveness, answering every question directly while providing nothing that could be used against him. He demonstrated the demeanor of a loyal servant shocked by tragedy, concerned about the plantation's future, worried about what would happen to the enslaved workers now that the Whitmore family was gone. He asked if he should continue maintaining the household, if someone would be appointed to manage the estate, if the workers should proceed with normal routines or wait for instructions. These practical questions reinforced the image he was projecting, someone whose primary concern was maintaining order and continuing his duties, someone who could not possibly have committed murder because he was too invested in the existing system's stability. Sheriff Braddock interviewed Isaac 3 separate times over the course of the investigation, each time probing for inconsistencies or revealing details, each time coming away with nothing, except confirmation that Isaac's story remained unchanged. Dr. Merrick observed one of these interrogations and noted in his journal that Isaac seemed profoundly affected by the tragedy, showing the attachment that sometimes develops between servants and the families they serve over many years. Even Merrick, who was more observant than most, who had begun to suspect that the murders required someone with intelligence and planning ability beyond what white people typically attributed to enslaved workers, could not penetrate the performance Isaac had perfected over 3 decades of survival. The coroner's dilemma, truth versus convenience. Dr. Augustus Merrick spent 3 days examining the 7 bodies, conducting the most thorough autopsies his medical knowledge permitted, documenting symptoms and searching for evidence that would provide definitive answers about cause of death. What he found confirmed his suspicions but created enormous problems regarding what he should officially report. The physical evidence pointed toward poisoning by a sophisticated combination of plant-based toxins. He identified traces consistent with amatoxins from mushrooms, cardiac glycosides possibly from foxglove or oleander, and perhaps other substances his tests could not detect. The dosages had been precisely calculated for each victim's size and age, indicating knowledge that went far beyond lucky improvisation. The precision disturbed Merrick more than the deaths themselves. Someone had studied these people, had understood their weights and constitutions well enough to administer poison that would kill without causing symptoms, violent enough to wake them or alert others in the house. This level of sophistication suggested planning, measured in months if not years, suggested intelligence and education that contradicted everything white Mississippi society believed about the people they enslaved. Merrick understood the implications of his findings. If he officially declared this a poisoning, it would require an extensive investigation that might never reach resolution. It would terrorize every plantation family in the county, making them fear their own enslaved workers, potentially sparking violence and reprisals that could spread beyond anyone's ability to control. The careful social order that Mississippi's white population had constructed would be shattered by the revelation that someone had executed an entire family with such planning and precision. He met with Sheriff Braddock and 3 county magistrates in a private session to discuss the situation. The magistrates were less interested in truth than in stability, less concerned with justice than with preventing panic. They pointed out that officially declaring this a murder would require identifying a perpetrator, and if none could be found, it would suggest that the county's authorities were incompetent to protect its most prominent citizens. Merrick made his decision based on cynical realism. He ruled the deaths as caused by unexplained cardiac and respiratory failure, possibly related to contaminated food from the Christmas dinner. A tragedy, but not a murder, requiring further investigation. His official report made no mention of the wooden splinters holding eyes open, made no mention of the precise positioning of bodies, included nothing that would suggest deliberate arrangement or symbolic message. The Whitmore family was buried in the county cemetery with full honors, their deaths attributed to God's mysterious will, and the investigation was closed by the end of January 1850. The trial that never happened. Justice deferred. No one was ever formally charged with the Whitmore murders, though suspicion inevitably fell on the enslaved population of the plantation and surrounding estates. The weeks following Dr. Merrick's official ruling saw a wave of intimidation and violence directed at enslaved people throughout Wilkinson County, as planters attempted to extract confessions through methods that ranged from enhanced interrogation to outright torture. Several people were whipped until they could barely stand. Others were locked in isolation cells for days without adequate food or water. Some were threatened with sale to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. But nothing resembling a useful confession emerged from these efforts because there was nothing to confess for most of those being questioned. And the one person who could have confessed chose silence with the same discipline he had maintained for 34 years. Isaac was interrogated 3 times under conditions designed to break resistance, but each interrogation produced the same result. He maintained his story with perfect consistency, showing neither evasion nor nervousness, answering every question directly while providing no information that advanced the investigation. His performance was so convincing that even those who suspected him could find no crack in his narrative, no moment of weakness or contradiction that could be exploited to extract truth. He seemed genuinely bewildered by the suggestion that he might know something about the deaths, genuinely concerned about the plantation's future, genuinely willing to help investigators however he could. The white families of Wilkinson County desperately wanted someone to punish, needed someone to punish, because without punishment, the deaths remained inexplicable, suggested vulnerabilities they could not defend against. But without evidence or confession, they faced a practical problem. The enslaved workers they suspected represented significant financial investment. Executing people worth hundreds or thousands of dollars based solely on suspicion would damage their own economic interests, would set a precedent that made property rights uncertain. Eventually, the desire for vengeance collided with economic reality, and economic reality won, as it almost always did in Mississippi's plantation economy. The official version of events solidified around Dr. Merrick's ruling. The Whitmore family had died from tragic but natural causes, possibly related to contaminated food, a reminder of life's uncertainty and God's inscrutable will. Some families increased security at their own plantations, hiring additional overseers, implementing new rules about food preparation. But there were no trials, no public executions, no official acknowledgement that the deaths might have been murder rather than misfortune. The dispersal. The Whitmore estate was liquidated. With no surviving Whitmore heirs and no will that could be located, Isaac had destroyed Thomas Whitmore's hidden will after memorizing its contents. The plantation entered probate in February of 1850 and was sold off piece by piece throughout the spring and summer. The land was divided among 3 neighboring planters who had been positioning themselves to acquire Whitmore acreage for years. The mansions and its contents were auctioned in March, with furniture and decorations purchased by families eager to own pieces of what had been one of the county's finest estates, though some items went unsold because potential buyers considered them cursed, tainted by association with death, and the 89 enslaved people who had worked the Whitmore plantation were sold to various buyers across Mississippi and Louisiana in a series of auctions that treated human beings as liquidated assets, distributing them to maximize the estate's value with no consideration for families that were separated, relationships that were destroyed, communities that were scattered. Isaac, now nearly 50 years old and classified as a skilled carpenter and reliable house servant, attracted interest from multiple buyers despite his age. He was eventually purchased for $950 by Samuel Morrison, a merchant from Natchez who owned several commercial buildings and needed someone with carpentry skills to maintain his properties. The sale separated Isaac from Sarah, his wife, who was bought by a cotton factor from Vicksburg, who planned to use her as a cook in his household. They had lived together for 29 years, had survived the sale of their children, had endured decades of cruelty and separation and reunion. Their final goodbye took place in the auction yard, a brief moment where they were allowed to exchange a few words before being taken in different directions by their new owners. Witnesses who observed this parting reported that Isaac showed no emotion, accepted his new circumstances with the same patient compliance he had demonstrated throughout his entire life in Mississippi. No one watching that moment thought to wonder whether Isaac's compliance had ever been real, or whether it had been all along simply the disguise that patience wears while waiting for its moment to strike. The white people observing the auction saw only what they had been trained to see: obedient workers being transferred from one owner to another, property being reallocated according to market principles. Isaac went to Natchez and began his new life with Samuel Morrison, who found him to be exactly what had been advertised: skilled, reliable, uncomplaining. Morrison never knew that the man repairing his warehouses had committed the most sophisticated murder Wilkinson County had ever seen. Isaac lived 12 more years in Natchez, working for Morrison until his death in 1863, still enslaved, having witnessed the beginning of the Civil War, but not surviving to see its conclusion or the freedom it would bring. Dr. Merrick's journal. The truth. One man. Carried to his grave. Dr. Augustus. Merrick maintained his medical practice in Wilkinson County for 23 years after the Whitmore deaths, never publicly deviating from his official ruling that they had died from natural causes. But his private journals, discovered by his daughter after his death in 1872 and eventually donated to a historical society, tell a different story entirely. The journals reveal that Merrick's thinking about the Whitmore case evolved significantly in the years following the deaths. In entries made during 1850 and 1851, he recorded growing certainty that Isaac had been responsible, that the poisoning had been too sophisticated, too perfectly executed, to have been anyone else's work. He detailed his reasoning: Isaac's access to the kitchen, his knowledge of the family's routines and preferences, his intelligence that Merrick had observed during their few interactions, his motive that anyone paying attention would have recognized in the sale of his children 2 weeks before Christmas. His perspective shifted further during the 1850s as he witnessed the escalating brutality that characterized Mississippi slavery in the decade before the Civil War. He recorded incidents that troubled him: enslaved people beaten to death for minor infractions, Families separated on the whims of owners facing financial pressure. Women subjected to sexual violence that everyone knew about but no one acknowledged officially. He began to understand that the Whitmores had not been exceptional in their cruelty, but merely typical. In an entry dated August 15, 1857, Merrick wrote something that revealed how completely his thinking had transformed. "I have spent 7 years believing I knew who killed the Whitmore family. But I have only recently begun to understand that I was asking the wrong question. The question is not who killed them, but what killed them. They were killed by a system that allowed them to purchase human beings, to separate children from parents, to inflict cruelty without consequence or restraint." In his final entry about the case, written on October 3, 1871, less than a year before his death, Merrick posed a question he never answered. What is murder when committed against those who have murdered your soul every day for 34 years? And what is justice in a world where law protects monsters and calls their victims criminals? I cannot bring myself to condemn Isaac, if indeed Isaac was responsible. I cannot call it murder when it looks more like defense, like the assertion of humanity by someone from whom humanity had been systematically stripped. The legend that remains, whispers that outlive truth. The story of the Whitmore Christmas murders passed into local legend, accumulating embellishments and alterations with each retelling, transforming over generations from documented tragedy into folklore that reflected the anxieties and assumptions of those who preserved it. The white version of the story emphasized mystery and tragedy, a prominent family struck down by inexplicable misfortune, a reminder of mortality's uncertainty. Some versions claimed the mansion was haunted by spirits of the murdered family, that visitors to the ruins could see the ghost of Marcus Whitmore walking the halls, searching eternally for his killer. Other versions suggested that a traveling stranger had committed the crime, a mysterious figure who had appeared in the county shortly before Christmas and vanished afterward. This version was comforting because it located danger outside the community, suggested that the murders had been imported rather than generated by local circumstances, implied that Wilkinson County's own enslaved population posed no threat to their owners, but among the descendants of the people who had been enslaved on the Whitmore plantation, a different story was preserved and passed down through generations. In this version, Isaac was remembered not as a murderer, but as an instrument of justice, as someone who had waited with infinite patience until he could strike without risk to others, who had chosen Christmas Day deliberately for its symbolism. A celebration of birth used to deliver death, a holy day desecrated by people who had desecrated humanity itself. Whether Isaac ever confessed to anyone, whether he felt guilt or satisfaction, whether he believed his actions were justified or damnable, remains unknown. He died in Natchez in 1863, still enslaved. His last words were recorded by Emily Morrison, the teenage daughter of his owner, who sat with him during his final illness. She wrote in her diary that Isaac had been delirious with fever, speaking in fragments about children and Christmas and doors that would not open. His last coherent statement was simply, "I lived long enough." What he meant by that, Emily never understood, but perhaps it meant that he had lived long enough to see his plan succeed, to witness the family who stole his children, removed from a world they had poisoned with their existence. Perhaps it meant he had lived long enough to prove that even those deemed powerless could find ways to exact consequences when patience, intelligence, and opportunity finally aligned. Or perhaps it meant only that survival itself, under circumstances designed to crush the human spirit, was its own form of defiant victory. The truth, like Isaac himself, remains silent, buried in the Mississippi soil, alongside all the other secrets that antebellum America tried to hide beneath its white columns and careful lies.